Um, Hello, everyone. Thank you for your earlier introduction, Deborah. Very nice to see you again. Hello, Chicago, and hello to all the attendees today. I'm so pleased to have this chance to share some recent ideas with you. As my colleague, Xiaojun Wu, described, the Seattle Asian Art Museum reopened in February of 2020, that's last year, after an extensive project to modernize its historic facility. And these are the physical changes that spurred a new curatorial direction for presenting the permanent collection. We have a new extension for the first time in our history, 2 galleries dedicated to special exhibitions, plus 13 permanent collection galleries, as she described. So instead of Chinese art in the North Wing suite of galleries, Japanese art in the South, South Asian art in the middle, as before, there are now 13 distinct themes and 13 galleries. This was our moment to make a big pivot for the future, a chance to dream a little. The floor plan symmetry dictated some kind of bifurcation for a simple walking tour. 6 galleries in the North Wing address how works of art express material and worldly functions such as power and status, and 6 galleries in the South Wing consider how the region's art served faith and belief. The 2 highlighted here focus on word and image topics distinctive to Asian art, and 2 galleries ask questions, explicitly requesting the viewer to bring their own experiences to bear. We sought a balance in themes that were in some way accessible to every visitor and concepts broad enough to sustain 80-piece rotations for light-sensitive works every 6 months for 3 to 5 years. How did we come to these themes? In the first step, the 3 curators selected what we felt were the very finest and most interesting works in the collection. We organized these into clusters in one of the galleries, fondly renamed our playroom. And then we observed what concepts arose most naturally from pieces when they were next to each other in juxtaposition. Thus, each theme emerged from the collection itself. Of course, we had to realistically assess the collection's strengths, which still maintains the mark of a private collector, our founding director, Richard E. Fuller, who commissioned our building to house his donation of Chinese and Japanese artwork in 1933, the first Art Deco museum in the USA. There is a recent appetite in museology for displaying, eschewing linear sequences defined by culture or chronology. Many museums mix time periods as a matter of course in order to stimulate visitor curiosity. Our museum also embraced this strategy, so every gallery interweaves historical and contemporary artworks into a dialogue. Another driving concept is the notion that culture does not only form within the boundaries of nation states. In the ideal, our assemblages would encompass unique characteristics of Asia's cultures and simultaneously suggest porosity of the Asian continent along land and sea routes, the transfers of knowledge that inspired innovation and bound together communities across ethnic or national borders in networks of trade and technology, art and belief. Art institutions outside the US have offered museological variety to the visitors for a longer time. The Tate Modern in London and the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris come to mind. I also consider 2 recent contrasting approaches. Here, Berlin's Museum of Islamic Art inserted interventions within their permanent display, which didn't change. These trace transcultural relationships between Near East and East Asia in ceramic trade, and it made the point that the material record of the Islamic world is not easily distinguishable from Western Europe in some cases. Whereas the permanent display staged by Jean-Hubert Martin for the Mona in Tasmania presented admixtures based entirely on intrinsic visual impact, divorced from original context. Martin claims the curator's prerogative to do away with linear and historical categories because neutral objectivity is anyway impossible, according to him. Our strategies, Our strategies were informed by studying these and other projects with their various strengths and weaknesses. Our most immediate of our concerns was finding coherence in multiculturalism, this important word that was mentioned earlier. One important critique bears keeping in mind. Commenting on ideological pitfalls and unintended consequences This critic wrote, quote, efforts to promote the values of pluralism and multiculturalism, though well-intentioned, can result in a flattening of difference in the service of majorities, elites, and the market. It can be a form of ethnicity management that glosses over real points of dispute, unquote. No doubt, in looking for alternative display narratives, we must look out not only for what is gained, but also what is lost. And indeed, a persistent challenge in any cross-regional or cross-temporal display is how to engage an object's culturally and historically specific characteristics. But to me, the answer does not necessarily lie in accepting that geography and chronology works just fine, so why rock the boat, as that critic advised, with different words. After all, the impression that there might be a concrete, fixed and monolithic Asia emerged in the late 19th century as imperial power sought to establish territorial boundaries. Our sense of the neutrality and the inevitability of museum categories is as a result of colonial geopolitics, whereby Asian relations and cultural patterns are defined in contradistinction to Western definitions of empire. To be clear, I am not interested in dismantling nation-based galleries, merely that we find ways to acknowledge their contingent nature, their subjectivities. We might state what they do really well, which is, in fact, to put our discipline on display here in the West. I outline aspects of our 3-year project in Seattle that many people have yet to see because of COVID, but my aim today is to expand on the impetus behind the Asian Art Museum's transnationalist strategies for being distinguishable from an uncritically homogenizing multiculturalism due to its grounding in Asia's regional histories, and also my own desire to better define what constitutes the basis for transnational display. Allow me to first elaborate on some choices made for Chinese art in our spaces, and then I will address the significances against mid-19th to 20th century paradigms for conceptualizing China through display. Why indeed search for alternatives to geography and chronology? Some common subjects, such as those related to Buddhist and Islamic art or global contemporary art, invite cross-cultural treatments. Sometimes the objects themselves are transnational. For example, this Tibetan officer's formal robe. The gallery asks viewers to think about dress, culture, and identity, and the pieces near the robe relate to occasion dressing, such as for weddings and tourist performances. The robe is a hybrid garment with Mongolian-style trimming, using what appears to be Russian silk brocade. The geography, context, culture could be Tibet, China, Mongolia, or perhaps even Russia. Another obvious candidate for engaging the story of cross-nation flows is this early 14th century blue and white plate from Jingdezhen, where potters from Islamic countries worked alongside Chinese craftsmen for the Imperial Bureau of Manufactures, made for export to the Middle East or to India to benefit the Mongol rulers of China. We might differentiate these two examples along sliding scales of hybridity, assimilation, appropriation. Their interregionality and intra-regionality appear in adjacencies representing ethnic and fashion identifications or neighbors and resource partners. Hierarchy of information is both a strength and a challenge of thematic galleries. And with the help of some didactics, this gallery takes on scales of value in presenting how what is desired, prized, and preserved is culturally and historically specific. First, the central axis highlights materials important to Asia's traditions: bronze, jade, ivory, gold, silk, rock, crystal, lacquer, making the mineral, organic, and metallic wealth of ancient and early modern Asia abundantly clear. Second, the flanking walls have examples of imperial patronage and some medium-based aesthetics prized by royalty at courts of Mughal India and Qing Dynasty China. Cross-cultural organization highlights how difficult it is to tell whether a jade carving is Mughal or Chinese, as in this ram's head dish on the left, copying Shah Jahan's famed wide jade cup. Unclear if carved in Xinjiang or interior China, since Chinese artists assimilated foreign elements of the art form. Likewise, artists outside China adapted their ideas to appeal to Chinese rulers. At right, this exquisite poppy blossom footed bowl represents another kind of cross-cultural intersection, a very fine Mughal carving about which the Qianlong Emperor wrote effusively and had his words carved into the side, thus straddling world eventually. Calligraphy and porcelain are essential categories to represent at the museum, but our challenge was to decide what was essential without essentializing. In this assemblage from East Asia and Islamic world, we found sometimes by chance of installation that juxtapositions allow commonalities to be shown even as the objects themselves are visually quite distinct. Here are two collaborations between calligraphers and painters. So Sotatsu's Deer frolic amidst Coetze's calligraphy in 17th century Japan, whereas Yang Hui's ink branch plum scoops up monk Zhen's farewell wishes for their mutual friend in 15th century China. Our Wen Zhenming masterpiece illustrates the imagistic qualities of writing. I made a conscious decision to provide Chinese characters so that viewers can compare the written and the printed, but intentionally did not provide English translation to emphasize that visual expression in calligraphy, the way it looks, is as important as what it says. Equal footing in numbers need not be artificially established. The story of porcelain tracks to China, so the checklist unabashedly fulfills the organizing principle, glaze color, with majority Chinese ceramics interwoven with selections from Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, and Iran. In other words, this nation-biased statement could not be confidently made except in consultation with other scholars and my co-curators, Daryl Mason and Xiaojun Wu. This gallery asks viewers to revel in the vibrant hues and tonalities of colors. There really is no other choice, since there are no labels. An interactive display contains all of the didactics. The blue and white section shows Chinese imperial wares, followed by those representing the geographic breadth of cobalt decorated wares, from a Persian glass bottle to a Persian plate imitating Ottoman ware, imitating Ming Chinese ware, to a 15th century Vietnamese plate from a shipwreck, representing those excavated in Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, the Persian Gulf, and Egypt, plus one interloper, an enameled metal jar pretending to be a blue and white. Congruencies between historical events and museology are given, and the earliest moments related to Chinese art are intimately tied to governance from the broader political sphere of US-China relations, but demonstrably sensitive to audience reception under local conditions in US cities. I find it useful to think of these legacies along four notions: ethnographic, ideological, museological, and intellectual transnationalisms. I find purchase in these categories for identifying decolonizing perspectives when, if, and when they arise. Chronologically speaking, the history of transnational display of Chinese art in America can be said to begin in the mid-19th century with Nathan Dunn's hugely popular Chinese museum that showed 1,000 Chinese objects, from porcelain obtained during his time in the China trade to mannequins dressed by rank and occupation, followed by John Peters' Chinese Museum in Boston of 1845 that too showed natively made objects and natively dressed mannequin informants, also paintings of Canton. Peters' display has political origins. He was a member of Caleb Cushing's mission to negotiate the first official trading agreement between the US and China. This is the Treaty of Wangxiao of 1844. His museum invited its highly literate, already knowledgeable audiences to reimagine China as a complex civilization amenable to diplomatic trade relations instead of a country ripe for conquest after the First Opium War. Borrowing the 16th century Gallery of Nations Kleiderkammer model, these displays cultivated an enlightened consumption of culture, countering sensationalist China fantasies more common in its time. Authentic experience thus lay in actual objects representing actual Chinese life. Based on the recent successes of Dunn and Peters, and with the lure of profit, Dick Hay Ying the trading junk built by British businessman Charles Kellett in defiance of maritime law, sailed from Hong Kong to London in 1846 and then New York. The vessel did not transport trade goods. It refigured objects and the 30 Cantonese crewmen into ethnographic dioramas to embody Chinese ethnicity and identity. And we saw this image from Stan's presentation yesterday. But the live exhibits found a changed reception with escalations in Chinese emigration and became racially charged, subject to derision, except that the owner quickly pivoted to convert his floating museum into a floor show for martial arts demonstrations, strange, comical spectacles for New Yorkers, Bostonians, and Londoners alike. This turn from exhibition to sideshow was preceded by P.T. Barnum's reworking objects from Dunn's Chinese Museum and postceded by the popular tourist practice borrowed from 1880s UK by Americans. In news reports that you see here from 1903 and 1909, the entire New York Chinatown was a living museum complete with the theater of depravity, opium dens, poor people, gunfights, strange foods. The dark side of verisimilitude is clearly present in the desire to penetrate the life spaces of others. Now, slumming may be an unusual route to begin a discussion of higher conceptions of culture, taken up as decolonizing Asian nations of early 20th century sought notions of culture and civilization to mirror that of the West. Asia is one, was the famous opening line of Okakura Kakuzo's 1903 book, a statement central in his later hagiography as hero prophet of Asian unity. The Asian studies field recognizes that 19th, 20th century national models of space made culture and political authority congruent. Intensifying anti-imperialist narratives arose within and outside Asia, giving rise to how intellectuals conceived Pan-Asian solidarity. Okakura, Rabindranath Tagore, and other intellectuals held to notions of shared civilization and spiritual values manifest in the arts through the interconnected aesthetics of Buddhism. And the earlier art of China and India were a means to a regional coherence above divisive national interests. In Japan and North America, Ernst Fenollosa established Asian art as a legitimate domain of high art, fit for museum collection and display, as is well known. He served as the first Oriental art curator of Museum of Fine Arts Boston from 1890, and then Okakura became curator. Fenollosa argued that Asian art could be folded into universal logics of art and its transcendent values. This advocacy for East Asian art's relevance was for its sameness, its compatibility with existing categories of the Western canon and criteria for the fine arts. American collectors of Asian art also expanded upon existing classifications. Charles Lang Freer, for example, established a new collecting area of Buddhist figurative sculpture. Freer collected American and Asian art and saw the latter as a source of needed inspiration to reinvigorate what he felt were languishing traditions of Western painting, using his museum to define a certain kind of modernism. But even with increasing travel to Asia and access to scholars in Asia, for Freer, the aesthetics and edifying qualities of Asia's great civilizations was primary. These ideals remained firmly held by leaders of the field decades later, for example, Sherman Lee, who began his career as assistant director of Seattle Art Museum. For Lee, the museum was first and foremost, quote, a primary source of wonder and delight for mind and heart, unquote. The turn toward aesthetics by cognoscenti, connoisseurs, and museum professionals in Chinese and Japanese fine art was distinct from earlier avenues for displaying East Asian culture for an international audience in the Victorian era, namely the World Expositions. With 10 million people in attendance, the Centennial Exposition created widespread knowledge about East Asia, and it marked the beginnings of American museum collections of Asian art, as is very well known. Both the China and Japan exhibits were commercially successful, but the Centennial judges found China's effort less able to meet the exposition's ideals, expectations instead deemed embodied by the technological feats of Japanese bronzes. Responsibility for the China display was left to the Imperial Maritime Customs. It was experienced in facilitating commerce, and so selected porcelain, cloisonné, silk carvings, too many man-hours spent on craft, according to judges. These categories, familiar from China trade, were sought after for domestic display, but did not much engage the rhetoric of industry. As attitudes toward China changed over the course of the 19th and 20th century, so too did exhibition practices evolve. Even though museological discourse imbricates colonial and geopolitical patterns, the more pressing internal concern was one of classification, to distinguish art museums from the functions of ethnography, anthropology, and natural history museums, requiring divisions to be made between art from craft, aesthetic from theory, from practice, and art museums distinguished the singular and elevated from the vernacular and commonplace. And in North America, the ideals of high aesthetics defined much of its purpose by the 20th century. The first decade of the 20th century is also the moment when public pressure on museums to fulfill their public function came to fruition in New York. The Met announced that rather than allow gifts to direct its quote, it would now build collections, quote, according to a comprehensive scientific plan, and allow museum men to blend restricted collections into art historical schemes. Chinese art at Met was at first shown amidst donors' collections, such as the Avery Chinese porcelains and the Bishop Jades in a recreated European palace. But upon founding the Far Eastern Art Department displayed at the Great Hall balcony, even as the Met celebrated its centennial in the 1970s, the only Asian art on view was the ceramics on the balcony and in the Chinese Buddhist art gallery. Thus, spatial priority for China remained remarkably tenuous until the advocacy of my former advisor, Professor Wen Fong. In short, the decisive early 20th century turn toward fine arts, brought about by individuals determined for China to represent civilization rather than trade, came about at the moment when museums first began to think seriously about how to uphold the public mission alongside donor interests. From these beginnings of the East Asian field of art history were region-specific galleries in US encyclopedic museums eventually born. For Asian art, professionalism was tied to area expertise, but not always highlighted in discrete spaces for display, the exceptions being standalone facilities built by Freer in 1923 and Richard Fuller in 1933. This structural legacy, centuries later, continues to hold sway. I have above related transnationalism to two types of transplantations, east to west. Keiying literally floated its cultural theater upon the waves of changing public attitudes toward China, whereas notions of Asian solidarity, culture, and civilization held by Okakura, Fenollosa, and Freer gave impetus to realign US museum priorities and categories. Pan-Asianism, tied lethally to rising nationalisms of its time and to Japanese militarism, became tainted, and it was not until the Bandung Conference of 1955 when a similar spirit of solidarity against imperialism and racism was expressed in its promotion of interregional cooperation. Supranational conversations of contemporary artists and curators tend to distance themselves from earlier notions of Pan-Asian solidarity or national civilization, even though post-World War II, post-Cold War eras, echoes of global past connectivities remain in the global present. From the 1980s, contemporary art exhibitions organized along global regional frameworks began to emphasize connections between Asian countries instead of essentialized Asian identities. One exhibition invoked the authority of Cold War era sinologist Takeyoshi Yoshimi's influential Asia as method, which conceived of an Asian modernity in its engagement within the region rather than relative to the West. Given that Asia's method might function as intellectual anchor within Asia for some, our curatorial projects articulating continuities across Asian cultures here still doomed to fail. My question is, has multiculturalism reached an impasse, tainted as a basis for displaying images of the other in the West? African anthropologist Ivan Karp eloquently stated that politics of producing the image of other requires a poetics not just of difference, but also of similarity. This well describes the perils all curators must navigate. A survey of Chinese ceramics from the Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing, grouped by medium, underpinned by time, within an envelope of present-day national boundaries. The textbook provides the motto: chronology surrogates for in-person expertise. Tension is always present in balancing aesthetics and original functional context. And for both African and Asian art, there is a further bind in that display techniques reliant on visual interest for deciphering culturally unfamiliar clues are assumed also enough for transforming audience non-recognition into a positive encounter. Everyone's favorite illustration of the pitfalls of multicultural juxtaposition is MoMA's 1984 Primitivism in the 20th Century, which showed tribal art informing Western modernisms from Cubism to earthworks. The MQB exhibit that I show here produces the continents after 19th century French geographic knowledge. The crux is historical narration, when blind to unequal relations, treats the other as compranda. Earlier, I touched on Jean-Hubert Martin's Tasmania venture, and here is again Martin's Magiciens de la Terre of 1989, which is the first major global survey of contemporary artists that ignited a heated debate and foregrounded the need for a post-colonial discourse of exhibitions. Martin was critiqued for exoticizing third-world artists, but of course, his survey was the first to utilize a global framework, and it did provide a platform for 3 Chinese artists, including the late Huang Yongping, who Nancy Lin discussed this morning. In Paris and Tasmania, the viewers left to their own devices for informal, unstructured viewing in spite of the 50-50 numbers of Western and non-Western artists at Magiciens. In today's parlance, equality is not necessarily equity.
Oh, we've reached time. My apologies for breaking in.
Nevertheless,
conclude.
Tatehata Akira, the former director of the Osaka National Museum, observed that Magiciens inspired the next generation of non-West exhibition planning, whereas MoMA's primitivism did not. And I take Martin's point that analogical thinking of free juxtapositions, power relations be damned, as opposed to logic and rationalism, has its advantages. Still, alternatives to this mode of freewheeling multiculturalism remain few. Our work over just 3 years with just 3 curators generated a dozen different ideas for nonlinear display for Seattle. And we offer a transnational strategy that I hope is distinguishable from a homogenizing one, because a picture of a profoundly interconnected ancient global Asia potentially offers views into pre-colonial Asia. If not specifically informed by Asia as method, the options for Asia-centric rather than Euro-American-centric display are exciting to conceptualize. Still, Sam's new display raises points for caution and self-reflection, because we may acknowledge assemblages as incomplete scenarios, but we still determined what embodies the essential. We still decided on what is distinctive and exceptional. Museum spaces are powerful. Knowledge can be curated into being. We developed our project in Seattle immediately before a sudden societal shift brought by the death of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, converging with COVID-19, and now again, rising anti-Asian sentiment. Needless to say, the landscape looks different as we reevaluate all our priorities. But if I may predict with optimism for museums, we may shortly arrive at a post-pandemic future where the lines between permanent and special exhibitions are less clearly separated, the local and communal voice is much louder, and in this future, our expertise and processes for locating transnational narratives cannot be but deeply collaborative. Thank you.